Hello, good people. This is Sister Julia Walsh, and you're listening to Messy Jesus Business. Welcome to The Mess. Hey everyone, it's me, Sister Julia, with a special invitation to join the Messy Jesus Business community for an experience of virtual faith sharing and prayer during Holy Week. All are welcome to come contemplate the mess with us on Monday, April 14th, 2025 at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. See messyjesusbusiness.com for details and register. We'll see you there. I'm here with Michael Poffenberger, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Action and Contemplation, founded by Father Richard Rohr. A graduate of Notre Dame, Michael previously served as the Executive Director of Resolve, where he worked alongside religious and civil society leaders to build peace and aid to war-affected communities in Central and East Africa. Michael, welcome to Messy Jesus Business.
Thank you, Sister Julia. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I think where I'd love to start our conversation is just hearing about you and your passions, your story. How did you end up in this world of ministry and action, this world of activism, this world of contemplation? I was thinking about this. We're both vocation ministers in different ways.
Yeah.
We do the work of spiritual accompaniment.
Yep.
How did this become who you are?
Unexpectedly, I'll say that. It was never how I saw myself or imagined my future. So I was raised Catholic, but in a multi-faith family, and really connected with my faith in high school to the point where I joined World Youth Day in 2000. I went to Rome, saw Pope John Paul II, and I think I was just one of those people that always had that curiosity about all things spiritual. Grew up in a pretty conservative context, household and community. But when I went to college at a Catholic university, I really discovered and connected with the social justice and contemplative traditions within the Christian stream. And really had this kind of radicalizing experience participating as a freshman in college on this protest to the School of the Americas.
I've done that.
Yeah, have you?
Yeah.
It was such a formative experience, like to be with men and women religious in this deeply spiritual procession, claiming witness to lives lost at the hands of violence endorsed in some way by our own government.
Right.
I remember it being this really spiritual experience. We had crosses with the names of people who'd been killed that we were chanting, as we walked. And it was a very liturgical kind of a protest. And so for me, that was this awakening to the social teachings of the church in a kind of a prayerful setting that just sent me on my path. As tends to happen, I identified more with the activist side than the contemplative side. So I majored in peace studies and spent 10 years doing policy work in Washington, D.C., focused on preventing mass violence internationally and kind of influencing U.S. government policy in a variety of ways. In a lot of ways, I saw that as my spiritual path, as the manifestation of my faith. That at the end of the day, it's really about how do we be in solidarity with suffering in the world and enter into the pain of our reality in a way that is and can be very transformative. So for me, that looked like wearing a suit and tie and going to meet with policymakers in DC during that period.
Lobbying, huh?
That's right. Yes.
Fun fact, I was a lobbyist after college too.
Oh, really? Who did you lobby with?
The Iowa Catholic Conference. So I was at the State House in Des Moines. Yeah.
Wow. On peace and justice issues? Or?
Yeah. I mean, church, any bill that impacted the Catholic Church or connected to Catholic social teaching, which was a lot of bills. So I was tracking immigration and green energy bills, but also things related to cemeteries and schools and insurance and everything.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a formative experience, right? To see how the system works and
totally.
Like the skillfulness with change. Like you can have all the best intentions in the world, but you got to learn how to navigate the system to actually have the impact that you want.
Yeah.
So what happened for me though was that work. I just I was in relationship with leaders in communities that were impacted by this really horrific violence. And I didn't have the tools to really sit with that and hold that in relationship to my day-to-day life, trying to go meet with people in this system that frankly just didn't seem to care or want to bend to that reality. Mm-hmm. And also just struggling with my own kind of ambition and careerism. I was in my 20s and like this sense of the desire to influence things. And well, that's a good desire because I want to influence things for good. But is that just too much ego or, power seeking? And I didn't have tools to really navigate that. A mentor friend passed me one of Father Richard Rohr's books and encouraged me to go on this thing called the Men's Rites of Passage, which was this 5-day kind of wilderness initiation. And that was really what lit me up, because he has this way of communicating the depth of our tradition in a way that feels very fresh and very relevant to our lived experience, including for me, the experience of engaging with issues of suffering and injustice in our world very directly. I hadn't really been engaged in spiritual community of any kind, but started a contemplative group with some friends and really started down this path and tried to start to integrate, right? What is this inner life, this interiority, this relationship with ourselves and the different aspects of ourselves and how that shows up in the ways that we are in the world. In the roundabout way, then that led me back into my current professional life at the CAC.
Yeah. Title is executive director, but how do you interpret what that means? Not in an administrative sort of way. I'm sure you're doing things, but like, I'm curious, like, how are you living your vocation in that role?
That's a good question. You're distinguishing here, I assume, vocation from job, right? In my experience, it's even harder for those of us who work in a ministry setting, to use that word, to maintain that separation, right? Our jobs oftentimes become our identities. I see this too in the activist world or just the social change world. There is no distinction between my sense of inner vocation, the depth of my vocation, and the job I happen to occupy. I feel that hazard, right? I am a person. Michael Poffenberger is not executive director. You know what I mean? I have my own God-given, deeply implanted personhood that is apart from that. I've said this to friends sometimes, that my deepest fear is that my gravestone will be like, he was a good executive director. You know what I mean? Like, that is not it. I want to be a good executive director, but that's not what we're here for. That's not what the depth of our union with the divine really calls us into at the end of the day. So I see that in a couple ways. So like, one is I try to maintain that connection to the heart of like, what guided me here? What guided me here was not a desire to have an impressive sounding job title. What guided me here were these formative experiences with people who root their lives in a set of values that leads them into even a countercultural posture and how they show up in the world, that helps them make decisions that on the surface of them don't necessarily make sense to our dominant culture, right? Voluntary simplicity, solidarity with the global South or with the working poor, in our communities or the immigrant communities. These are not things that in our American culture of success and accumulation make any sense, right? And there is a risk, I think, and I feel it, of like occupying this role with that kind of a careerist orientation. Like, oh my gosh, I get to be the guy that takes over the organization from Richard Rohr, just approaching it in that mindset. So for me, it's like, how do I just remain connected to the heart space, which I don't really have language for? Something guided me on the path to this being about a bigger mystery that is beyond words, that matters more than anything, matters more than my title, more than my paycheck, more than any kind of status or security that I can gain through the role. For me, how do I maintain that active connection in my prayer life and in my vocational life outside of the workplace? And then how do I bring that into the organization, right? Because organizations have their own rhythm and beat and culture that is professional and isn't the same as being in a spiritual community, right? We're here to do a job. We're not here to really grow spiritually, even though, of course, our jobs are places where we can bring our spiritual selves if we're discerning about that. So how do I lead in a way that creates that space that retains that connection, felt connection for our internal environment and in everything that we do as an organization? That yes, there is a skill of just how to run an organization that is itself part of that vocation, but then there's that depth dimension of it. And I think that's really where my professional life feels like that connection to that deeper vocation. And to be honest, I feel like a toddler still in terms of like how hard that is sometimes and how complicated that is in the context of our busy professional lives to create connections that aren't about just the job or the career or whatever, but are actually about retaining this sense of connection to something very real that sits beneath it. The heart of not just me and my vocation, but the heart of this mission, the message, that we put out in the world.
Thank you so much for unpacking that. And I've heard so much here that I want to unpack some more. So,
Okay.
I would love to go back to this word that you said at the beginning about influence and how when you were lobbying in DC, really trying to be an advocate for people who were suffering from violence, influence and ambition and ego, it was wrapped up in that work. And I've been thinking so much lately, just in light of our context, the mainstream culture in the United States is really teaching us to be rich, famous, and influential. Like those are actually the values.
Well, quote unquote influential.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about how the gospel values, or just even the general Christian values of being people of faith and hope and love, if we're centered on those, we are counteracting that dynamic. We're resisting it. We're allowing ourselves to be more grounded in what I'm hearing you name as the relational way of being a person of connection, a person of humility. You said you feel like a toddler in the work. So I wonder what you're learning about how to be a person of gospel values as a servant leader, while there's all these other energies swirling around, suggesting that you need to be rich and famous and influential.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to borrow from Father Richard's teachings on this one. If all I do is share some of what he's put out in the world, it's probably going to be better than anything I can offer into this conversation myself. Contemplative wisdom really gets to the heart of what you're asking. And I want to start by acknowledging that influence isn't bad. Exercising power in the world can be a good and healthy thing for us as human beings, as an expression of our God-given creativity. And even like fame and celebrity isn't in itself bad, right? In contemplative teaching, the focus is not on the thing, it's on the relationship to the thing. How do we understand what's primary and what's secondary, right? The Buddhists have this phrase, skillful means. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but say there's a handful of principles that are all about how to have right relationship to yourself and the world. And then there's the last one that's like, and also be skillful at what you do, exercise influence in a way that has craft. So in the contemplative tradition, we learn to observe our own attachments and the things that we orient ourselves and we seek meaning and identity from that aren't God.
Yeah.
And as we learn to see those things and just acknowledge them, that's it. That's all we have to do is be honest with ourselves about ourselves, what's actually happening, give that up to God, and then transformation happens. And transformation happens not because of our force of will to change ourselves. It happens because of our capacity to witness ourselves with honesty in prayer and then be healed by God. So when we think about the influence in celebrity, right, I would just say, how do you retain that capacity for honesty? Richard didn't start, I can say this because I've worked with him for 10 years now. He didn't start the CAC to become a celebrity teacher. He has this deep sense of like, I have to be true to my own inner convictions. Nothing else matters. And he did that for long enough that the integrity of his message itself generated a following and made him a celebrity. And in a sense, that celebrity can be useful, right? Like it's a useful way. Richard has a certain reputation that attracts people who want to study with him and learn from what he teaches. That's not in itself bad. But if that becomes the primary motivation, then that's what in scriptures would be called a false idol, right? The celebrity supplants the thing itself. So I think it's just how do we cultivate that capacity to be honest about our own motivations? And in an organizational life, how do we cultivate the capacity to hold things in right relationship, right? Like it's great when we execute a marketing campaign and it connects people into our work. I don't want to diminish that, but that's also not God. So let's just keep those things in right relationship. And at the end of the day, the God part matters a lot more than anything else, right?
I'm thinking, as I hear you break it open that way, about a lot, including the call as we walk with Christ to be people that are constantly pouring ourselves out for the other. It is true that we make idols, we get attached. Those things start to become obsessions and then become the thing that we're pursuing.
Yeah.
But the kenosis energy of Christ, the pouring outness of the love of giving oneself to the other, in that energy, I think more truth is exposed, right? And it's a very vulnerable energy to say, like, yeah, I don't know, but let's try this thing.
Yeah.
I don't really know what God's doing with me, but I'm just going to show up and admit to you that I'm tired today. And let's be in this space together.
I think you're getting to the energy of the thing. So Richard has these clever rhetorical frames. He uses true self and false self. That's from Thomas Merton, but I think others have used that frame. He uses first half of life and second half of life, where he talks about the job in the first half of life is to kind of build the container, build that sense of positive identity. Yeah. And then the second half of life is to understand the contents, and which is really an emptying out of that container, right? To understand that our containers are transient, passing, mortal things that aren't it. So in that frame, identity development, positive identity development is a natural psychological human process, right? We learn that we are loved as we are. That means you, Julia, are loved exactly as you are, with your bodiliness, with your quirks, with your interests and your passions, all the different ways that you might have an identity or a personality. The trick is to know that love is precisely what enables us to transcend that personality construct. And to move into a space of vulnerability and trust. One thing I've learned from Richard, if it's something that I can create or control, it's not God, right? It's a construct of my personality, of my attachments. If you're not vulnerable, you're not on the path, right? If you're not losing that sense of control, then you're not letting God into your life in that way.
I'm just cracking up right now because I'm reminded when we were together last fall in DC at that lovely conference with the Franciscan Action Network, one of the campus ministers that was there with a group of students said to me, Julia, you're kind of quirky. Does that get in the way of you being in relationship with people? I mean, I don't think anyone had ever said that to me before in my life. And the campus minister was like asking me this with the college students around. So I kind of wondered if it was like a teaching moment.
Yeah.
How I responded was like, oh yeah, I guess I am. But like, I'm hoping that it doesn't, because it allows other people the freedom to show up and be true to who they are when they're with me,
That's the gift of the path. That's the healing that happens. Like every group and any culture, subculture that you encounter, right, is going to have its own unwritten codes for what's acceptable and what's not. That's an inevitable part of group identity formation, just as much as anything.
Right. And somehow I've been dense to that my whole life.
Dense to, or the gift. You've been gifted with naivety to that your whole life. But what happens though is, I think on the journey, like as we gain connection to that true self, the permission to not fit in with ourselves starts to shine. My colleague Paul Swanson calls it letting your freak flag fly.
Yeah.
That like, the people who've kind of gotten to that maturity because they're not afraid to be weirdos on some level.
Yeah.
But the confidence as a weirdo is what's attractive to other people, because it gives us all permission. Like not all of us are weirdos on some level. Do you feel like you had, like growing up, that just sense of unique? Yeah. How would you describe that?
Well, wait now. I'm supposed to interview you. I think that because, and people who read my work and have read my book and stuff, they would know this, that I fell in love with God at a really early age. Yeah. And I've taken my faith seriously since toddlerdom, because that love of God has been the thing that's amplified the way I show up and am present to others. the way I'm living my life, I was dense again. I was a little slow to realize that other people were not on the same track.
Wavelength.
And that was probably like one of the biggest heartbreaks in my early life, when I realized that other Christians didn't really know and love God in the same way that I was so blessed to.
Most people are just trying to fit in when they're young. Yeah.
So I think that's how it's had an impact on me.
Wow. That sounds like both a gift and a burden in a sense.
Oh, yeah. Totally. Well, obviously it made childhood and adolescence pretty tricky, but then once you get in those spaces where people are attracted to weirdos, then it works.
Yeah, there you go. You always find your own eventually.
What about you? Like, how has it been for you to like come more and more into the freedom?
That's a good question. Freedom is a good word. Growing up, I fit into more categories, right? And again, blessing and curse, right? Blessing, I didn't struggle with feeling like I fit in, like I know many young people do. And curse, in that you become trapped, I think, by the sense of wanting to maintain that belonging that you get out of conformity to the group norms. And as I think I've gotten older, I think it's a very natural process of comfort with my own rough edges. I don't know if I would say quite to acceptance. That's still working on that one. I'm only in midlife here, Julia, but the spiritual piece, even in our broader landscape, how hard it is to identify sometimes as a person of faith or even as a Christian in a context in which most people see those of us who follow Jesus under this stereotype of racist, sexist, homophobic, and otherwise. And to see Jesus as a wisdom teacher who's been ripped out of that context, even that is in some ways something I'm trying to step into and live into. I'm part of all these different kind of interspiritual spaces and communities, people who are into kind of the secular mindfulness. I just got back from a Buddhist retreat even. I did a 10-day silent Vipassana retreat, which was incredible. But I was like, I miss God. Like there's something in that affective connection that is not just about observing the sensation of the breath within the phenomenological framework of the body. I get emptiness as a metaphor, but it's not my metaphor. I think for me, part of it has just been, I am a spiritual geek, like at heart. And yes, I think I can fit into other spaces in some ways, but that geekery, like when I'm around the spiritual geeks, is when I come to life. Yeah, and I think I'm trying to get to be that more comfortable with just being clear about that. That's kind of who I am.
Yeah, it's like claiming the nerdiness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
When I was teaching high school, I felt like that was really what I was trying to do, is help the young people become aware of their passions, right? And isn't that what educators most are trying to do, is increase that self-awareness, that consciousness in folks. And I think as we get to know ourselves better, it breaks up the divide between us and God somehow. Do you notice that too?
I think that's right. Like if we can't accept parts of ourselves for ourselves, then we can't offer those parts as part of our wholeness to God, right? We're only bringing part of ourselves to the table.
What are you noticing in your work? Are people experiencing transformation? And what is that like? And how do you witness that?
Yeah. I'm going to start with the Sufi aphorism that I've heard Jim Finley, one of our faculty, teach. He says, the wild ass can't be caught by chasing it, but the only way to catch the wild ass is to chase it. It's a aphorism to get at the paradox of will and grace in the process of transformation. Meaning God meets us all the way where we are, but we also have to consent and to seek for God to meet us all the way where we are. Jim's words to describe the contemplative path, he says, it's about putting ourselves in the path of least resistance to being overtaken by grace. I love that because I think it really describes the reality of what our job is. Our job is just to learn how to see ourselves and to offer ourselves up. In the context of our programming, that's what we're trying to equip people to do, to give them tools and lenses to understand our tradition, Jesus' teaching, the lives and witness of mystics and saints in a manner that is enabling our growth and development as human beings to consent to God's grace and participation in our lives. I think sometimes that means helping people heal from the ways that we internalize these narratives that being a person of faith is about conforming to certain group standards, exactly like what we've been talking about,
Right.
as opposed to letting God access our interiority and be on that healing journey. And then it's also about recognizing that that means showing up in the world in a way that witnesses to the illusions and delusions of our broader culture and society.
Right.
That when we consent to these stories and systems that dehumanize some people, in a sense, we're participating in the dehumanization of ourselves. That as we gain our wholeness, we seek the wholeness of the whole. So teaching can only get people so far. We hear this a lot, that what our work does is people experience it as a sense of permission, really, to ask the questions and pursue the wisdom that starts to bubble up in the context of our own lived experience. And I don't want to diminish the role that plays. I think it can play a big role. That sense of a helpful map to what this journey is ultimately about, according to the people who've gone further and faster than most of the rest of us. But then it's really about people's capacity and sincerity in living that out in their own day-to-day lives. That's the transforming agent. And of course, God meeting them in that. We also talk about, being part of this broader movement. So we think of our role, right, as teaching, but how do we help people be connected into communities of practice and opportunities for embodied action in the world, all of which is part of how we understand the path of transformation, that if it's not being manifest in these different ways, right, then it's just our own privatized, individualized seeking of our own superiority. It can actually be subverted as an act of ego. That's one of the biggest critiques, I think, of the contemplative space. It's like, oh, it's a bunch of people navel gazing, self-obsessed. It can become its own privileged club. That's not the path we teach and the path that we're trying to support people on, but certainly a piece of it to be aware of.
Your description of wholeness, it made me curious about, in your own experience, in your own life, your own path, but also as one who's walking with others, how is the transformation of the body, the mind, and the spirit all integrated together? What are you noticing about how those dynamics work with each other and help a person to become more whole?
Can you say more about that question, like the dynamics of body, mind, and spirit being integrated?
What I was thinking about, and kind of back to your example about how folks who are critical of the contemplative path sometimes accuse folks who meditate as doing a lot of navel gazing or sometimes avoiding, right?
Yeah.
As one's inner life is transformed, does that then impact the way their minds and their bodies are healing or changing? And then does that impact how they are relating to community and in relationship to the world? Like, what's
how does that work?
Yeah, right?
Okay, that's a big question. Richard, in some of his earlier talks, he used to teach contemplation as the change that changes everything.
Yeah.
And he was being purposefully provocative because in his mind, this is the interpretive key that is the difference between a Christianity co-opted by empire and as a tool for oppression, and Christianity as a liberatory process and system. That it all comes back to this notion of the contemplative mind. In contemplation, the observation is that everything that we see in the world, we interpret through the lens by which we see it. And contemplation is really about helping us to identify those lenses. And as we learn to see those lenses, they begin to heal. Like we begin to not be so addicted to our own particular ways of thinking and perceiving, but to take in more and more of reality. And so what happens in contemplation is you begin to see the patterns of your own self. You can watch your own thoughts, and instead of immediately attaching to them, you just experience that little bit of experiential freedom. It's kind of like, you can use this terrible metaphor, the old Catholic school of like the sisters coming around with the ruler to put it between the two people dancing too close. It's contemplation's like putting a ruler between me and my thoughts, me and my instinctive reactions and judgments. Richard talks about this in the Psalms, talks about how like we're like a dog returning to its vomit. 99% of what we think is addictive, habituated, reactive, self-centered thinking. So in a sense, until we learn how to create that just bit of space between our own patterns and then how we choose to show up, all we're doing in the world is projecting our own unmet psychological and egoical needs through all the ways that we interact with others. My fiance, she's a doctor. She works with homeless people in this field called street medicine. Amazing work. It's so inspiring. It's all about how the system's not designed to help people who are traumatized by the system. So how do we go to them, right?
Yeah.
And so she has this big skepticism about spirituality because it's like, oh, it's, just get out there and serve. And in service, we have that self-transcending experience sometimes.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think that in a sense can be a path of contemplation because in encountering people experiencing this suffering, our own attachments to avoiding it become exposed,
Right.
Like I think that's very real. At the same time, what we see is people in those spaces, and she's coming to grudgingly acknowledge this, who are seeking to meet their own unconscious needs for validation or significance or whatever. And that distorts the ways that you can actually be present to people because you don't realize it, but you're actually trying to meet your own need even as you're engaging somebody in this act of service. And so it's really, how do we do both, right? How do we be prayerfully learning to witness our own patterns as human beings and allow God's grace in as a healing agent and show up in the world in ways that challenge our stories of ourselves and the stories of how our systems and societies work. Richard's a Franciscan, and I know that's your inheritance, but that's Francis, right? Like Francis.
Yep, 100%.
Action and Contemplation. His first seminary, the novitiate, so to speak, of the Franciscans, he was very skeptical of teaching theology. It was walk with another Franciscan in service to the poor for a year.
Yeah, go live with the lepers.
That's it. That's how you get initiated into life as a Franciscan. Francis also went to the caves and retreated into nature and would spend these long periods, 30 or more days at a time in solitude and in prayer, and in contemplation. So he really role modeled that. Prayerfully gaze at your own patterns, give them up to God, and then serve others. And then in that dialectic, that's the whole thing, right? That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it. If only it was that simple, right? But yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, as a student of Father Richard Rohr, and one of the people who's really helping his legacy to live on, he's still with us, thanks be to God, but we know he is not immortal. What you're describing all makes sense. It's kind of like it's like almost like a logical, countercultural way to go. Yet, it's messy, right? We are a Messy Jesus Business podcast here.
Heck yeah, super messy.
So let's explore the mess a little bit.
All right, let's get into the mess. This is where it gets fun.
What are you noticing about the tension and the struggle and how conversion and transformation has these patterns to it? I mean, I'm wondering if you have something to say about that.
I'll give you another Richard teaching that I wrestle with all the time. As somebody born into all the different forms of privilege, I check most of the boxes, and who holds a positional title of executive director that sounds so fancy.
Right.
I sometimes am under the delusion that means I'm supposed to have answers to things. And Richard talks about the contemplative path as learning to be comfortable not knowing. And ultimately, that's the sign that we trust God. In our confusion, in our conflict, in our failure and imperfection, we can give that up to God and let go of any attachment that it's ever going to be solved for us. Because the good or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that much of the time it's not. We don't, in this side of life at least, get to understand the full reality of the mystery and the answers behind everything, right? It never comes. In my 20s, I remember seeing guys in this work who were working on their path, who talked about their contemplative practice as this lifelong thing. And I remember feeling this sense of like, what do you mean? Like, don't you arrive at some point? Sadly, no. So Richard has this framework. He writes about it in a book called The Wisdom Pattern: order, disorder, reorder. And it's very simple. It's a modern kind of secular framework for understanding what we in a more traditional Christian framework might call the Paschal mystery of life, death, and resurrection. He says there's no nonstop flight from order to reorder. You always have to pass through that stage of disorder, that things fall apart. It's just the way of life. Death is a part of life.
Right.
And our faith ultimately, in allowing that death, in allowing that unknowing to happen, is the only way that grace comes in.
Yeah.
It's only by dying to ourselves, which unfortunately in the human condition is usually imposed on us. It's not something we can do ourselves. It comes through death. It comes through failure. It comes through debilitating illness. It comes through the breakdown of relationships. It comes through failing at our paradigms of what we thought was going to be successful or meaningful in life, right? Like the bad news is this is the inevitable part. It's the fly in the ointment. It's the part of the human journey. But the faith is being open and discerning. And instead of trying to hold on for dear life to that first step of order and doubling down on order, we open ourselves up. We trust God. We trust the process. We allow it. It's always painful. And then something comes out the other side. That's faith. And I don't think we can grow without that capacity to die. The beauty of it then is that we learn to have faith, and then we don't have to move through life from the sense of trying to control everything in a way that suits our preferences. We can be with things as they are in that graced way, and life suddenly becomes much more enjoyable and free and surprising and grace-filled in a way that when it's just about me seeking my own agenda, it's actually not very meaningful or enjoyable. That's the paradox.
What about that messy spot, though, when you feel that pain of realizing, oh, I've been attached here? How do you notice that in the prayer life, in the practice, when you're in relationship, when you're serving others?
One thing I have learned is the body doesn't lie. And I've learned this through mentorship and coaching to, first of all, pay attention to my own body. I notice that what happens in my body when I'm experiencing something I don't want to exist is this constriction. So like, let's say somebody's bringing me a difficult piece of information. A donor doesn't like something that just happened. How am I receiving that? How do I be curious? How do I stay open? How do I leave open the possibility of a transformative encounter?
Right.
When I'm constricted in my body is my first sign that I'm trying to control this situation because of something that I like or don't like about it. So I think that's one way. And then I think community is the other gift, right? Like how to be open to the gift of community. And professional workplaces aren't the same configuration of community as we might experience in family or in church or in our small group. But it's a community nonetheless, and a healthy professional workplace. I think the sign of health in any community, including workplaces, is the capacity to engage negative information. Especially look around us in this moment in our society.
Yeah.
The atrophy of our capacity to listen to each other as human beings coincides with the polarization where everything becomes negative narratives about the other side in one sense or another. I'm not trying to equivocate and saying all things are equal here, but I am saying that we better learn how to practice that skill of listening to things that we don't like and people whose opinions and experiences are different from our own to find a way forward as a society. And I think for me as a leader, I had to go through a real process of that. Like I was convinced that I had the right answers and I didn't need other people's opinions sometimes. And people experience that and it's harmful. So I think that's a piece of it too, community.
Let's talk about the action part.
Okay.
What for you is the challenge when you're facilitating a center that's really known more for its contemplative teachings, right? That's the reputation it has at the CAC. What is the challenge of inviting people to act?
This is a very hot question right now. We're recording this conversation at a moment when people are being forcibly deported from our country and separated from their families, when the death penalty is being restored at the federal level, when our relationship to the whole notion of compassion and empathy with each other as human beings is being drawn into question.
Yeah.
I think our orientation as an organization historically has been exactly as you say, like people act And in their action, they come to discover the need for contemplation, to ground their action from a deeper place. So how do we provide that? The danger of that, as we've talked about, is in this broader context in which people see their spiritual path as their own privatized individual thing. And that's not how Jesus lived or taught. That's not how Francis showed up in the world. And our founder, his whole charism is how do we combine action and contemplation, not just individual action of being a better parent or a better friend, although that matters, but action in the sense of engaging in the social order is his words for it. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's not something I think we've done particularly well. I think we teach it, we say it, but it's not embedded in the nature of how we guide people. And so the questions that we're asking now are actually more about how do we bring that into the experience of connection to our programs, to not be complicit in this kind of broader cultural individualism that wants to separate out our individual, private, spiritual paths from how we engage in the social order. There's little ways that we try to do that. We try to role model that as an organization with how we steward our resources, with the ways that we engage with our staff, with so on and so forth. There's ways that we teach that in our programming, but there's ways that we can do a better job partnering with other organizations, providing opportunities for people to engage in different forms of social action, actually rooting our programs in lived contexts. We used to take people across the border to Juarez and teaching contemplation in the context of a border community of the immigrant poor. It's a totally different paradigm than a hotel ballroom, you know?
Yeah.
It's not to say that what we do is bad. It's just like, how do we not lose the tension and invite people into it and recognize that the medium is the message sometimes. I don't think we do it perfectly. It's an active conversation, and I'm excited to stretch into new boundaries with that moving forward.
The time has flown. I feel like we could talk for hours, but I know you're a busy man. So if I may just ask two more questions.
Sure.
One is, what does discipleship mean to you? What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ?
To always be open to allowing myself to be formed and challenged by the depth of Jesus's teachings in this tradition. It doesn't mean that it's about arriving or behaving in a certain way. It's about, in my own integrity, am I open?
Openness. That's beautiful.
There was a teacher, his name was Adyashanti. He primarily taught from the Eastern traditions, but he wrote a book called Resurrecting Jesus that I thought was amazing. And I heard him speak once, and he said, sincerity is ultimately the only thing you need on the spiritual path. I'm trying to learn from that, which also means practicing forgiveness when we're not there, right? That's the flip side of it.
Amen. Thank you to that. Another pointer to the messiness. Yes. And Michael, what would you like our listeners to know about you and your work and how they can support it?
Oh, thanks, Sister Julia. So one, just it's a gift to be in this conversation with you. So first of all, I just want to say thank you. And to your listeners, thank you for caring and for being in this. And then secondly, just if folks are interested, our website is cac.org. And we're relaunching our Living School Essentials of Engaged Contemplation is what it's called. It's a 1-year formation program this year, but there's tons of different ways folks can connect and get engaged if they're interested in learning more.
I'm aware Richard Rohr had another book come out recently, The Tears of Things, right? So that's one place where they can start, is by engaging in the work that he's put out in the world.
That book, I think it's his best. It's his end of life salvo. Yeah. So I could not recommend it more. It's gorgeous. And the timeliness, I mean, it's called The Tears of Things, Prophetic Wisdom for an Age of Outrage. And it's all about how do we hold our anger and allow God to change it into sadness, and to hold the reality of the world, and to trust that will lead us in the ways we need to be led. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Ooh. Talk about some messy Jesus business.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on
Sister Julia.
Jesus Business. Yeah. Thanks so much. Messy Jesus Business is produced and edited by Colin Wamsgans. You can find us online at messyjesusbusiness.com. and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon. If you like what you heard, please be sure to mention our podcast to your friends and followers. And we'd love to have your support via Patreon. From the bottom of our hearts and the middle of the mess, thank you. Messy Jesus Business is produced in partnership with the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. You can learn more about our religious community and donate to our mission at www.fspa.org. I'm Sister Julia Walsh, and I'll catch up with you next time. Until then, peace and all good.